general government. We'll work through it. We will then move on to transportation and complete transportation. If not by 2 o'clock, we'll break, go to the floor, take care of business, probably come back here around 3 to complete transportation, and then pick up tomorrow morning with resources with the game plan of finishing it because it's Friday. And we have to have our first reading completed by then. So we're almost there. Bear with us. Good morning, Ms. Bosler. Page 1, Office of Emergency Services, Regional Railroad Accident Preparedness and Immediate Response Fund.
Yes, good morning. This issue on page 1 is a carryover issue that we started to discuss last year. And this was an administration proposal in response to the significant increase in oil shipments that are expected by rail in the coming years as more and more supply is coming out of the Dakotas and elsewhere. The rails go through many urban areas in our state, sometimes very close to housing and large population centers. And the idea behind this proposal is to provide an ongoing fee that would be used to support emergency response efforts specifically related to the transport of hazardous materials on our rails. This would be monies that would support both state infrastructure, but more going directly to locals to deal with specific hazards and also make sure that the emergency response is robust if there ever was to be an emergency situation related to a spill at the rail. So our language we've been working on for many months now and are getting more broad agreement with stakeholders. And so we support the Assembly that adopted that language.
And there would be a fee structure to support this. Can you talk to us about that, please?
Absolutely. Brennan Murphy, Department of Finance. So the fee structure that is there is inherent, and it would do a couple things. So it would cap the fee at $20 million in the first 2 years, thereby allowing us to repay the loans and create a very relatively small fund balance of approximately $7 million. And in the ongoing, so after the first 2 fiscal years, it'll cap the fee income as far as from the fee at $10 million per annum. So the structure being that we don't want to create some large fund balance that we don't intend to use or don't intend to very expressly derive for this purpose.
And who will pay the fee?
The fee is on the owners of the hazardous materials that are being shipped. The fee is the top 25 hazardous materials as identified by the National Transportation Board. And the owners would be responsible for paying. The railroads would be responsible for collecting that fee. In addition to, they have a small administrative piece that they can keep to cover their costs of collecting the fee.
Is this a top 25 list that NHTSA would do for us, or does it already exist?
It already exists. So we would be using their annual top 25 list.
And are other states already doing this, or what kind of response have other states put in place?
There are a few other states who have similar programs. Up in Washington, there's a program on all petroleum movement. As you know, this is much broader, so this covers all hazardous materials. And in Minnesota, there's also a specific fee on rail petroleum movement. So there are other fees out there, but I think there's still many looking to what we do with this to determine what their path forward would be.
So clearly, we would all benefit from this. Communities would be safer. Important issue we have to address. One question that comes to mind is, are there any Prop 26 issues, as in we're having an industry pay a fee that will benefit all of us?
Yeah, so the way we've attempted to address Prop 26 issues, most of this money is going to be used to buy equipment that will be housed locally in fire service across the state, relatively close to rail lines. in that, to the use of that equipment for any response to hazardous materials that is not on the rail, the local fire agency will actually reimburse the fund for the cost of using the equipment in that manner. So thereby being that the fee that we're collecting is only used to support the response to the rail and on the rail line.
We also have a serious concern about trucks as well.
Yes, we do, and that's not to minimize that concern. The reason this proposal addresses rail, though, is because of the broad scope of a derailment and the massive nature of those cleanups. You know, clearly a truck incident is generally located in a very small area, and although it can be very hazardous to your travel in that area at that point in time, these rail incidences, you know, if you remember up in Quebec and in Eastern Virginia, have actually affected whole towns or portions of whole towns. That's really the catastrophic nature that we're trying to address with this proposal.
Thank you. Mr. Soderberg.
Drew Soderberg, Legislative Analyst's Office. I'll turn it over to Virginia Early.
Hi, Virginia Early, Legislative Analyst's Office. We are recommending the Senate action, which is to not approve and refer it to Policy Committee. We feel that the proposed trailer bill raises several policy and legal questions that we feel like could be better addressed in a Policy Committee setting. For example, while the trailer bill specifically allows for resources to be used to respond to rail hazardous material accidents, OES, as was mentioned by the Department of Finance, has indicated that local governments would be able to use these resources to respond to non-rail hazardous material accidents through a reimbursement structure. We feel like there is substantial legal uncertainty whether this would be allowable based on the way the fee is structured and based on the limitations on fees in the state constitution. And then if it turns out that it's not allowable, then there are other questions about how to, policy-related questions about how to resolve this, whether and how the fee structure should be modified to allow the resources to be more fully utilized. And just one more point. We also note that while rail accidents are more catastrophic when they do happen, 92% of the transit-related hazardous material accidents in California were actually by truck. And so it seems while the state will need to have response in the case that a rail accident does occur, it seems likely to us that these trucks would sit unused most of the time unless they were able to respond to these other types of hazardous material accidents.
I want to make sure I understood you correctly. 92% of all accidents or most damage caused by accidents?
So this is the cost of the responding to the accident.
The cost, 92% of the cost of all accident response.
Of two hazardous material transit accidents.
Due to transit hazardous materials in transit.
Yes, yes. So this includes the cost of cleanup, the damages that are made, and so forth.
92%. Ms. Bosler.
Yes, so I just want to, one thing that I think, because we've been discussing this internally for 2 years, and last year there was a proposal that was not approved, and I understand the statistics that she's talking about, but you know, emergency response is primarily a local responsibility, and what we're trying to do here with this program is really fill gaps that exist if there was ever to be a very large catastrophic event with a train derailment near an urban area. So this is not meant to be able to solve every single truck issue. I mean, that is certainly a concern, but local governments do allocate a large amount of money to their fire and their first responders and are already doing that. This is really to help fill those gaps. And if there was a more catastrophic accident that required a lot of regional support, this money is being put in place to help our state Office of Emergency Services coordinate with those regional providers to make sure that there isn't a large amount of time that lapses before they can get the support that they need. And so this is really about putting a lot more readiness on the ground so that if in the event something happens, people will be ready and there won't be large time lags for response.
It's a very interesting debate, and what trains and trucks have in common is they're both in transit and they're coming in and out of our municipalities. So it's not a municipal situation within their control, it's just happening, and they're the bystander. So that's what they have in common. 92% is very compelling. I could ask another dozen questions easily, but I think what it suggests is the LIO has a good point. This really should be delved into in a policy committee, because we could spend a lot of time on this, and I'm not even quite sure which way I would go. Clearly, something tragic could happen at any time, but at the same time, we want to do it right. Now, if we were to broaden this to include both trains and trucks, do we have to switch from a fee to a tax, or could we still do it through a fee?
Well, we could switch to a tax, or we could change the way the fee is structured so that the fee would be assessed also on trucks as well as trains. And actually, this program is based off of a program that was active in the early 90s that both assessed a fee on trains and on trucks carrying hazardous materials throughout the state, and that fee expired in 1995. So it is possible, but it would raise a lot of questions for the legislature. For example, currently the fee is structured to only apply to the top 25 highest volume and most dangerous hazardous materials traveling through the state, and so specifically by rail. And so, would you want to change that list? I mean, maybe different amounts of hazardous materials travel by truck. Maybe there are different issues that should be considered there. That because of the economics, different materials often travel by truck. It doesn't make sense to, for example, carry a lot of petroleum in a truck, whereas it's more economical to do that in a train.
One thing that does give me pause, and I understand the urgency of it, and if we could take care of it now, all the better, as opposed to waiting until January and then getting to this at the end of that year. But I'd also feel somewhat responsible if we rush to do this, and then 9 times out of 10, the damage caused is going to come from a truck accident, not a train accident, and we didn't deal with it at all. And that fee expired in 95. So any other thoughts on this? Senator Nielsen.
Mr. Chairman, there are some compelling points here that are raised that I think, as you acknowledge, do warrant an extensive review in policy committee. The benefit is to all. And I might notice not just an urban issue. In the late 80s, there was a derailing in the Sacramento River north of Redding, out of Dunsmuir. And all the hue and cry at the moment was going to kill all the fish in the Sacramento River. That did not happen. Now, that doesn't mean that precautions don't need to be taken, and they have been. And I've been on that rail both before, during that incident, and since. And the amount of money the railroad has put into those canyon areas, just incredible, to ensure that that doesn't happen again. So the railroads have been responsible and proactive. I'm not inviting a tax now on the trucks either, but I do think that there may be some consideration of other ways to accomplish our purpose here. I would just acknowledge that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Assemblywoman.
Yes, the Assembly agreed to the governor's proposed language, and I guess our concern continues to be the need to enact something to respond to this situation that we could probably debate it forever, and then let a tragedy occur, and then we stand there scratching our heads. I'm not as concerned about whether or not if a truck accident occurs, would we use these resources and then get reimbursed. I think if we didn't use the resources and a truck accident occurred, we'd look rather crazy. We saw that happen in San Diego when we had those big fires. And folks tried to figure out, can we use the planes from Miramar? And they sat there scratching their heads forever, and the fire continued to expand. And we looked kind of crazy because we had resources sitting next to the fire that we didn't use, talking about territory and whose responsibility and whose planes they were and who do we ask to use the planes. After that fiasco, they realized that if there's a plane nearby that can carry water, go get it and put the fire out, and then we'll figure out who pays for it after the fire's out, rather than allow it to expand. So we're supportive of this effort. I think with many of those who've been opposed to it have come on board now. The oil industries and others are in favor of this plan. Surely it's a work in progress. Nothing we ever do up here is perfect. We know that. It will continue to be tweaked, but it behooves us to do something. I think one thing we see that even though a number of accidents occur on trucks, the trains generally have far more impact in terms of damage because of the number of cars that are on a railroad, and as a result, its ability to spread and cause damage over a tremendous area. Plus, unfortunately, we're seeing more train accidents now. That's the sad part about it, and we don't really know why, but we're seeing more of those occurring, and the damage from those is rather catastrophic. So, we're in favor of this. Obviously, this is going to be held over for additional conversation, but I think we should look at this as a situation where whatever we do will be ongoing, that we will have to address the issue of the trucks eventually, but I never try to look at resources as being so exclusive that if a tragedy occurs, that people with common sense don't respond.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Just to clarify, actually, this has been in development for a while because we owe money to OES because funds have been expended to prepare us for any potential tragedy. And so we wouldn't let the fire burn. We'd address it if it happened. But we're trying to figure out how we're going to do it on an ongoing basis, and that's what's before us. And are we working on a compromise, or where are you with it? Is there anything bubbling?
My understanding is that work continues on the trailer bill. I think Department of Finance could speak to that. I'm not sure if any revisions are forthcoming, but I know that it's been revised several times, including not that long ago.
And then just one last question so we can move on. We've got this pending. Where are we with any consideration for the 92% of the expenses to deal with accidents coming from trucks?
So at that point, at this point in time, we have this proposal, and I think the big difference there being the catastrophic side. So I think it's really kind of a continuation of the discussion down the line as far as what would be some ways that especially local first responders be brought in, and what are maybe any gaps in their resources. This is one of those broader ideas that they had and said, look, we don't have the resources in many of the areas of the state to deal with a catastrophic response here. That's what we're trying to address at this point.
I would just suggest that we review what that fee structure looked like back in prior to 1995. We need something because 92% is a very large number, and we can't ignore it.
I guess, sir, I would only note that the feedback in 95 had a very different outcome and planning scenario. It wasn't quite used for on-the-ground resources being there to be able to actually respond. It was more of a planning structured fee that had various planning areas doing more planning-related work to try and respond if a disaster happened.
And the reason I focus on the trucks as well as the trains is that it's all well and good to say that's a local responsibility, but if there's something that happens, and these are large trucks and they're carrying volatile and hazardous materials, if it happens in a small town that's under-resourced and understaffed, they're going to need state help. We need to be prepared. Okay, thank you. Page 2 is Youth Emergency Telephone Referral Network, and this was an Assembly proposal. Ms. Peters, welcome back.
The Assembly added $200,000 from the general fund to support the Youth Emergency Telephone Referral Network at the Office of Emergency Services. We would recommend the Senate version on this one to not provide the augmentation because while augmenting services for youth may have some merit, we had insufficient detail on exactly how these funds would be spent to really assess the merits of the program.
Thank you. Ms. Posler.
This was not part of our proposal, and it's just a matter of priorities for general fund resources.
Assemblywoman, do you have any additional information to fill in some gaps?
I think this came out of our ongoing concern for issues of sex trafficking, foster kids, runaways, a host of other things, and looking at the fact that in a world where our young people text a lot, that we don't, that our referral agencies don't have the capacity to do that, and this would create that capacity and the services and the individuals to do it. If they're in peril, the ability to text, is a lot easier. And it's a small investment that may end up protecting children, saving their lives, and those kinds of things that maybe talking would not allow them to do it. So this came out of many of our advocate groups are talking about child safety. And so the Senate feels very strongly about this investment as we continue to work to improve and support young people.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Ms. Peters, I'm going to suggest that maybe you didn't get all the information from the Assembly. We seem to have a more complete proposal, and just suggest that you make sure you access it, because I think Senator Lara is prepared to move the Assembly.
Move the Assembly.
Yeah.
Right.
So on the Senate side, 2-1, 2-1. And on the Assembly side, for the Assembly version. Okay.
Mr. Bloom is not here yet, so we'll have to wait.
We'll keep that open. We'll keep that open for Mr. Bloom for the Assembly. Page 3 is anti-human trafficking, and this again is an Assembly proposal, something that Assemblywoman Weber's been working on. Ms. Peters.
Yes, the Assembly appropriated $10 million from the restitution fund on a one-time basis in order to provide competitive grants for local programs that support anti-human trafficking efforts. The grants would be distributed by the Office of Emergency Services. On this one, we recommend the Senate version because the funding that would be provided from the restitution fund to support anti-human trafficking programs would be essentially coming out of a pot of money that would support other victims programs through the Victims Compensation and Government Claims Board, primarily the Victims Compensation Program, or CalVCP program. That program broadly serves many types of victims, and so you'd be taking from that pot of money in order to provide money for a more narrow type of victim. In addition, the money through the CalVCP program is eligible for a 60 cent on the dollar federal match, and so making this shift could potentially reduce the state's receipt of federal funds by $6 million for victim programs. In addition, we would just note that the restitution fund is in a structural shortfall currently, and that's another consideration for you in terms of shifting these funds.
Thank you, Ms. Peters. Ms. Fosler.
This specific proposal was not part of our budget. I will just note that last year in the budget, we were able to provide some ongoing resources specifically related to human trafficking and sexual exploitation of children. That was approved through the Department of Social Services budget to be passed along to counties to specifically put together many more multi-discipline teams at the local level to make sure that there was appropriate supports and for these victims. I have the same notes that the LAO has about the fund condition. The restitution fund does have a structural imbalance. It does have some balance right now, but ongoing we'll have to adjust expenditures to meet revenues in the coming years.
Ms. Peters, we did an audit of the victim compensation program a few years ago, and it disturbingly revealed that over years we have seen administrative costs continue to go up and dollars getting to victims continually going down. Do you know what the update is as to their meeting the recommendations of the audit since then?
But we could follow up with you on that. We don't have any specific information.
The audit probably goes back 5 years or more, so I'd appreciate an update. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I wonder
Yes.
if it would be possible for us to get that information before we take a vote on this matter?
Certainly, we'll keep this open today, and any additional information you can get to us as to how badly it is structurally imbalanced and what you think the main drivers of the imbalance are as well.
And we have some information we can share with you right now on that if you'd like.
Go ahead, sure.
The structural shortfall for 15-16 for the restitution fund is about $13 million. And it's projected to have a fund balance of roughly 60 to 70 million at the end of the budget year. About half of the revenues come from penalties, felony conviction penalties, and about a third of the revenues come from fines and fees from court-ordered debt. And those sources of revenue just sort of broadly have experienced some volatility and a general decline in recent years. And so there's reason to believe that that sort of structural imbalance in this fund could get worse over time and further erode the fund balance. And because these funds are continuously appropriated to the Victims' Compensation Government Claims Board, it seems likely that if the fund balance were lowered by shifting these funds, that they may have to take actions to reduce the amount that they pay out to rates that they pay out to victims seeking compensation when they're the victim of a crime.
So I do note that this is a one-time. And I think one of the other stresses on the fund is that we took $80 million with no intention of repaying it. How many years ago now? I think at the worst of the worst times. So it's been hobbling along ever since then. Assemblywoman.
Yes, I just simply want to say we were, I know last year we put in some resources to deal with this whole issue of sex trafficking and dealing with young people. And this year we were, an advocacy group, statewide advocacy group called CAST came to us, and they've been doing this work for a number of years and basically identified for us some of the holes that were in our programs in terms of helping young people. One of the main holes, of course, we had to deal with shelter. You know, they said as they worked to, because much of the material we gave was sometimes in counseling, sometimes in arrest and those kinds of things. And as you do that and trying to change people's attitude and perspective, that even if we deal with the person, the perpetrator, and if we deal with some of the other things, these young people, as well as older individuals, often go back into the sex trafficking because they lack shelter. They lack a place to stay. And as a result, that's a major issue in terms of providing them with some form of shelter. So then they can move to take advantage of the counseling and rebuild their lives and so forth and so on. So that was one of the major issues that they brought to us that was very, very important, as well as legal services and various other strategies that were there. So we chatted with them and we made it very clear this is a one-time allocation. And usually when I say one time, I mean one time. It's a one-time allocation that helps this statewide organization to get the counties and the folks involved and to develop a number of beds for shelter. But that was their main focus, is of getting counseling support, but also providing beds, because they said with all the work they were doing, they found that if individuals didn't have a place to stay, then they would more than likely drift right back into the same world again that provided them with the support. Because it wasn't like they had family and somebody to go to. And then there was a lot of sex trafficking, bringing individuals across the border who had no contact, no support here. And so shelter became a major issue for this group, and it was a very diverse group of individuals up and down the state who were working on this issue of sex trafficking. Many of them were not actually social workers, but some of them were actually individuals here who work at the Capitol, who have just a special interest in dealing with this population, a lot of the professional advocates for different industries that are not necessarily tied to this. So we were very impressed with their plan. They gave us a major proposal on how these resources would be used and would be going into this area. That was great need that's there. So as we saw this emerging, we thought this is a way to encourage this development that's there, also putting resources directly into the areas throughout the state, because it's a statewide program. It's not targeted in one geographical area, but to really begin to respond to the issue of shelter for the individuals who are victims of sex trafficking. And while we noted that we had some shelter for young people, we did not have shelter for more mature women. There was no shelter for them that were in their 20s and 30s who were caught up in this sex trafficking, oftentimes being brought here and being abused. And once they were let go, there was no shelter for them. There was no place for them to stay. And so this was a part of that effort to try to begin to address the problem.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Worthy proposal, without question, and the need certainly is there. Getting back to the state of the fund, make sure I understand how this is going to unfold. So with regard to the passage of Prop 47, 10% of the savings, which is expected to be about $200 million annually, once fully implemented, 10% of that $200 million must go for victim compensation services through our Trauma Recovery Center plan that we are now replicating of a model from San Francisco around the state. And I would imagine that there'll be less demand on the traditional fee-for-service fund balance because many victims throughout the state will get the benefit of the Trauma Recovery Center services, which is a holistic approach to deal with victims of violent and traumatic crime. So I would imagine it would have less demand for the traditional use of victim services through the victim compensation funds. Is that accurate?
So I think some of the programs fund different things. It's certainly possible that expanding other services could reduce demand for the Victims Compensation Program. One of the things that we had recommended previously to the legislature was to think about all of these programs in a more comprehensive manner, and for one of the reasons to be to ensure that you're getting the federal match. And so if you're, shifting monies out of the Cal VCP program to other uses, and that's an approach the legislature wants to take. One of the things you may want to consider is, are there ways to still draw down those federal match even if you shift the programs? But it's entirely possible that the dynamic and the demand could change.
Thank you for reminding me of that. Do we know if we'll get the 60% match from the federal government through this 10% savings of the Prop 47 money?
It's possible. Our understanding is that some of the services provided by the trauma recovery centers would be eligible for the match, and I think the board is currently working with the San Francisco TRC as well as the other centers that are receiving grants on some reporting mechanism that would allow them to identify the portion of money eligible for the match.
TRC in San Francisco does get the federal match, so that would be a hopeful sign that we'll get it on the 10 million, 20 million annually that we're going to get from Prop 47.
Correct.
Good. Okay, so we're going to leave this open and work towards some sort of compromise. Page 4 is Nonprofit Security Grant Program, also in the Office of Emergency Services, and again, an Assembly proposal. Ms. Peters.
So the Assembly appropriated $2 million from the general fund to support the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. Our understanding is that this is a newer federal program that provided the state roughly $2.1 million in the last federal year, and will hopefully be providing additional federal funding to the state in the next fiscal year. We don't have a lot of detail on sort of the unmet need in this program since it's a relatively new program in terms of how the funds would be spent and what the ongoing unmet need would be given that some of the needs have been met through the prior year federal funding. And so on this one, we would recommend the Senate version and just note that there's probably likely to be federal funds continuing for this purpose.
Thank you. Ms. Bosler.
This is another issue that was not part of our budget, but we did have the $2 million in federal funds available for this purpose from the new federal grant program.
So I have some information from, in particular, the Jewish Caucus, which is very interested in this. The idea being that these dollars would allow eligible nonprofit organizations to obtain physical security enhancements and necessary security training to help them prevent and protect against acts of terrorism and hate-motivated violence. This is in light of the swastikas that have been appearing around the state, some of the other hate incidents right here in the Sacramento area, and impacting not just the Jewish community, but of course, African Americans, Latinos, Muslims, the LGBT community, Sikhs, Asian Americans, individuals with disabilities. The concern is broad. So I think there's value in this. I am sensitive to the general fund. I just want to suggest, colleagues, that we might consider, because I do think this is important, and unfortunately, in the current state of the world, we're going to see more of these incidents, that in thought of the very spirited conversation we had just yesterday with regard to the local law enforcement grants and that $40 million, that if, in fact, we were to, in the end, be supportive of those law enforcement grants, that this 2 million could be included within that 40 million. So I would make that motion if and when we get to that $40 million, but I'd be happy to support the Assembly today in this, and with the possibility of seeing it come out of that 40 million, again, when we revisit that in the next couple of days.
Okay.
So we'll take that as a motion from Senator Lara that we will take the Assembly. Senator Nielsen?
Mr. Chairman, I can support this. I certainly concur with what's unfortunately going on in the world right now, and I do think we are vulnerable. I am sensitive to the discussion as we proceed with the local law enforcement, whatever we come up with for them. I would rather look at this as being an add-on on top of whatever we choose to give and not inseparably linked. That's.
I love it when you're a big spender, you know that.
We all have our priorities.
I know we do, I know we do. So since that 40 million is not before us today, this 2 million is, both the 40 million and this 2 million are all general funds. We have a motion from Senator Lara to take the Assembly.
Mr. Chairman, may I just ask a question?
Certainly, I'm sorry I didn't see you.
That's
Go ahead.
okay. The motion is the 40 million with the 2 million included. No.
So let me clarify. So the item that we have today is just this 2 million.
Oh, so we're not going to,
I don't mean to confuse the two, but we will get back to that 40 million.
oh, I see.
And I'm suggesting that I will support Senator Lara's motion for the 2 million out of general fund for the purpose of the nonprofit security grant program. When we return to the 40 million, should we collectively agree to support that, and there, I'm sure, will be more specificity to it than it has been in past years. And again, I will want to have some greater certainty that it is indeed
Right.
one time and last time, but that I would be prepared to make the motion that we include this within that 40 at that time.
And I think that's,
But this is standalone
Right.
with regard to the motion before us at this time.
okay, thank you.
All right. So we have a 3-0 on the Senate side for the Assembly proposal, and 3-0 on the Assembly
Mr.
side.
Bloom's not here yet.
Oh, we'll keep it open. Sorry. Thank you. There's a busy man on the floor of the Assembly.